My topic for this final presentation is obsessive compulsive disorder, or O.C.D. It is a common chronic and long-lasting disorder in which a person has uncontrollable reoccurring thoughts or behaviors that he or she feels the urge to repeat over and over ad infinitum. Individuals with O.C.D. may have symptoms of obsession, compulsion, or both. These symptoms can interfere with all aspects of life such as work, school, and personal relationships. Obsession in this context is defined as repeated thoughts, urges, or mental images that cause anxiety. Examples of this are fear of germs or contamination, unwanted, forbidden, or taboo thoughts involving sex, religion, or harm, aggressive thoughts towards others or oneself, as well as having things symmetrical or in a perfect order. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors that a person with OCD feels the urge to do in response to an obsessive thought. Common compulsions include excessive cleaning and hand washing, ordering and arranging things in a particular and precise way, repeatedly checking on things, such as checking to see if a door is locked or that an oven is off, as well as compulsive counting. However, not all rituals or habits are compulsions. Everyone double-checks things sometimes. Like the other day, when I arrived at school, I grabbed my backpack and then locked my vehicle. And then once I was 10 seconds away, I had a thought, and the thought was that I may have left my lights on. And so I decided to walk back and open the door and look at the gauge cluster to verify. And the thought was right. My lights were on. If I did not acknowledge the thought, my battery would have died, and I would have been stuck at school for a numbered amount of hours. But luckily, I acted on the thought that arose in my mind. But a person with OCD generally cannot control his or her thoughts or behaviors, even when those thoughts or behaviors are recognized as excessive. They usually spend at least an hour a day on these thoughts or behaviors. They don't get any pleasure when performing these behaviors or rituals, but they may feel a bit of relief from the anxiety the thoughts have caused them, and they experience significant problems in their daily life due to these thoughts or behaviors. Some individuals with OCD also have a tic disorder. Motor tics are sudden, brief, repetitive movements such as eye blinking and other eye movements, shoulder shrugging, and head or shoulder jerking. Common vocal tics include repetitive throat clearing, sniffing, or grunting sounds. Those with overcompulsive disorder may experience symptoms that come and go and ease over time, as well as worsen. People with OCD may try to help themselves by avoiding situations that trigger their obsessions, or they may use alcohol or drugs to calm themselves. Although most adults with OCD recognize that what they are doing doesn't make sense, some adults and most children may not realize that their behavior is out of the ordinary. But parents or teachers typically recognize OCD symptoms in children. OCD is not a recent disorder. There are written records describing people who have suffered from what sounds like OCD going back as far as the 14th and 15th centuries. The specific symptom of unwanted thoughts that come out of nowhere and repeat in a person's head. The obsessions that people tended to report having back then were mostly of a religious nature and were referred to as religious melancholy. Religious melancholy described when people were suddenly overcome by thoughts that they felt were anti-Christian or blasphemous. Even though they tried to push them away, these people understandably felt almost unbearable guilt and shame because of these thoughts, and turned to the clergymen for advice. It makes sense that most recorded obsessions back in those days were about religion, because OCD tends to attack the things that we love and value. Religion was a very important part of people's lives and identities back then. Because of the societal context, it's impossible to say whether people who suffered from religious melancholy back then would be diagnosed with OCD today. The first time that something clearly resembling OCD appears in written records is often thought to be Magri Kemp's autobiography. Kemp was overcome by intrusive images that invaded her mind, like images of the local clergyman naked, and she felt so much pain and guilt about these images that she found herself praying incessantly to try and feel better. Her autobiography, which was written in the third person because of Kemp's illiteracy, describes the obsessions and compulsions that Kemp suffered through. A quote from her autobiography goes as such: "She thought these horrible sights and cursed memories were delectable to her. Against her will, wherever she went and whatever she did, these cursed memories remained with her. She was shivering and did all that she might, but she found no release until she was near at despair." End quote. Even though the understanding of OCD as a mental health disorder was inaccurate in a lot of ways back in Kemp's day, it's clear that people who experience these types of obsessions suffered just as much as people with OCD. Because these obsessive thoughts were usually thought of as religious affliction rather than a medical disorder, people who lived with OCD during these times turned to clergymen for advice instead of doctors. Some of the advice that these clergymen gave people suffering from religious melancholy were not too outlandish. An example of this advice is that the clergymen would advise that their parishioners would stop trying to push the thoughts away and to distract themselves with other activities, which is in line with some behavioral techniques that are backed by science today. Some leaders of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, however, insisted that people experiencing these compulsive thoughts needed to obey their spiritual advisors' instructions without any hesitation, and that was the only thing that people needed to do to recover. Of course, now we know that treatment of OCD is a lot more complex than obedience.